Every so often, you hear something that's simultaneously incredibly interesting and absolutely over your head. It's exciting and a little annoying. I hate it when you can tell something is fascinating, but because it's a dense subject or just a really new topic or something that has a lot of jargon, you can't really understand it. It makes you want to pin down the person who does get it and make them keep explaining it to you until things finally make sense. Usually, this is not possible. But, dear listeners, we have a podcast, and making people explain things that are cool but confusing until they start to make sense is, from what I can tell, basically the entire point of podcasts. So as I sat in a big, packed hotel conference room, listening to Dr. Ann Arnett talk about her work on genetics and ADHD, I felt a surge of joy. Ann is a scientist at Boston Children's Hospital and an assistant professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. She and her colleagues had come to APSARD, which stands for, bear with me, American Professional Society of ADHD and Related Disorders, to present their work on genetics and neurodevelopmental disorders. It's very much a work in progress, but the goal is to eventually figure out what, if any, role genes play in disorders like ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. Then they want to use that knowledge to help scientists build better treatments and understand more about the disorders themselves. The talk was fascinating, and I understood about half of it, okay, maybe more like a third, but when she was done, I got to do what I always dream of doing and have Anne sit down next to me and explain it until it made sense. Before we jump in, I should say that we had to record outside again, and it was very, very windy. So please bear with us through sniffles and wind sounds and any birds you might hear. This week on Hyperfocus, Dr. Ann Arnett. So I guess my first question is ADHD genetic?
ADHD is definitely inherited through families. So we call it heritable, meaning that it gets passed down through families and that within families or even within the population, most of the individual differences in ADHD traits and symptoms is due to genetic factors. But there's a difference between something that's heritable and something that's genetic. When we say the word genetic, we're talking about known genetic causes, like a single gene or set of genes that are causing ADHD. And right now, we can't explain all the differences in ADHD with those known genetic differences. So we look at like common variability in the genome or in the DNA. Those are small little changes that everybody in the population has. It's what makes us who we are. And then we also look at rare variants. Those are changes in the DNA that really affect the way the DNA creates a protein.
Try to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. A common variability is something that everybody has a little bit. Like everyone's genetic profile is going to be a little bit varied. And then rare variants are things that stand out.
So for each gene, there are a few different versions of the gene that are really common in the population. So that's what we would call a common variant.
Okay.
And then there are versions of the gene that can happen either spontaneously at birth or can be passed down through families that are really rare. We don't they might be like 400 in the entire world. 400 people in the entire world have this kind of change to a particular gene, for example. For a long time, we really thought it was only those common variants that were sort of adding up and increasing vulnerability for ADHD. But now some of the work that we're doing at Boston Children's with my colleague Ryan Doan is revealing that there are quite a few of those more rare changes to the DNA that are also contributing to ADHD in some families.
So do you say it's passed down through families? Mm-hmm. Does that mean, like, for example, my husband has a widow's peak and my daughter has a widow's peak? Like, that's a genetic pass down that I could understand. But it sounds like it's more than that because the heritability piece, which is the inherited piece, comes in?
Well, it's similar. It's similar to physical features. Some physical features are explained by just a few of those common variants. You know, we kind of know that there are only maybe a handful of those common variants that contribute to the widow's peak. But in ADHD, it's lots. I mean, like hundreds of genes are involved in brain development that leads to someone's ability to regulate their attention and their activity level and their emotions and all those things. And so it's just a lot more complicated.
So can I ask what might be a really basic question, but does that mean that you can, like if you could look at a map of my genes, I have ADHD, would you say like, oh, this one and this one and this one, that adds up to Ray having ADHD?
Only if there was one of those rare variant changes.
Okay.
And if it was a rare variant change that we've seen in other people who have ADHD or autism, or if it was a rare variant change that we also see in your family members who have ADHD.
So my mom has ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
And I know when you talk about it runs in families,
Mm-hmm.
is it just that it's genes passed down, or are there other factors that make that happen?
Genes get passed down, the environment gets passed down. The role of a gene is to essentially create a protein. The creation or expression of that protein in your body can be either increased or decreased depending on something that's going on in your environment.
Help me understand that a little
Okay.
bit more.
So, for example, there are genes in our body that are like cancer suppression genes or tumor suppression genes. And when you smoke cigarettes, for example, there's something in those chemicals that could deactivate or sort of silence that tumor suppression gene. So then the
That's
tumor
how
can
smoking
be
causes cancer?
in a very simple way, yes.
Never knew that.
Yeah.
So if I'm understanding it, you introduce things from your environment and you have whatever your genetic profile is at birth.
Mm-hmm.
And then your environment and the things around you, whether it's growing up in a household with cigarette smoke, or can it even be something like having a parent who's very disorganized?
Yeah. Well, typically we think of like a chaotic environment as something that could exacerbate ADHD symptoms in a person who's already vulnerable for ADHD, probably genetically vulnerable, but probably not causing ADHD. The environmental things that can cause ADHD are going to be like really extreme environmental adversity, like neglect. Kids in Romania, for example, who were institutionalized 20 years ago and had really poor care in the first 2 years of their lives and, very little social interaction. Those kids have really high rates of ADHD. And we think it's because they had this really extreme environmental deprivation early in their lives. That's not quite home chaos, right?
Yeah.
Like that's at a different level. Other environmental things that could cause ADHD are, if your mom was drinking when she was pregnant with you, prenatal alcohol exposure can cause ADHD. So most of the environmental contributions that we think about, like red dyes and chaotic homes, have actually really small contributions, but there are a few more extreme environments that can explain a lot of it.
So the fact that my mother could never find her shoes is probably not why I have ADHD.
Right. But if she wasn't able to, as a result, like model good organizational behaviors for you, it probably didn't help.
The genetic role in ADHD it sounds a little bit like a lot of people have the potential to develop ADHD, but not everybody does. And environment influences that, or no?
The genetic contributions are really strong.
Got it.
It's like 75% of the variability is due to genetic factors on their own.
Okay.
And so then the individual environment causes are only 25% of that. So I wouldn't say that there are a whole lot of people with vulnerable ADHD genes who don't go on to develop ADHD.
Okay.
But the severity of their symptoms and the degree to which it's causing functional impairment, that's probably moderated by the environment a lot
So you're
more.
going to have it, but the environment that you grow up in is either protective or exacerbating.
Right.
You also talked a lot about comorbidity with ADHD, other genetic things that come to light, like bipolar disorder or major depressive disorder, schizophrenia, that there's a lot of overlap. Could you help me understand that a little bit more?
So let's start with those common variants. When we look at the common variants that we think contribute to ADHD or related to ADHD, a lot of them overlap with the common variants that contribute to things like anxiety and depression and schizophrenia.
Okay.
So just essentially the genetic basis for the two disorders is very similar.
So I wonder about that a lot because we hear, I write about this, I have it, I try to learn as much as I can, and you often hear that people with ADHD are at much higher risk, as the words that they always use, much higher risk for major depressive disorder, for anxiety especially, for a lot of other disorders as comorbidities. And I think a lot of what I understood about it kind of up until now was that people will be like, well, yeah, of course you're anxious if you can't get things in on time, if you're always late, if you're having these like true executive functioning issues that come along with ADHD, it's going to cause a lot of anxiety and it may cause depression as well. But it sounds like in a lot of ways, the comorbidity is much, much deeper than that?
It could be. So we're actually looking at this right now in some of our data. I think there are two pathways to the comorbidity. So let's take anxiety, for example. Like you said, one pathway is that ADHD causes difficulty staying organized and being successful at your job and maintaining friendships. That's going to make you kind of anxious or sad or low, kind of stressed out, right? So that's sort of what we would call like a mediation path. It's through the functional challenges. Another pathway could be that the cause of ADHD is also causing the anxiety.
Yeah,
so it's shared.
That's the question I think I have.
So it seems like both of those pathways are true.
Okay, let's sum things up a little bit. ADHD is heritable, meaning it can be passed down through families, but that does not mean that it's guaranteed that if one or both parents have ADHD, their child will also have it. The environment plays a role, as does the way the person's genes are expressed. Another interesting thing Anne told me was that the genetic basis of ADHD has a lot in common with mood disorders like depression and anxiety, which could help explain why those disorders so often go along with ADHD. That's all to say, it's complicated, and it got me wondering, what does this all mean, especially for those of us who have ADHD? Anne herself acknowledged that it's pretty hard to explain.
Let's say we could look at someone's genome and say, okay, you have a change in your DNA that's been associated with ADHD before. And actually, a lot of those people who have this sort of change in ADHD also have anxiety.
Yeah.
If we know that early in life, before you start experiencing a lot of difficulties with the ADHD and the anxiety, the hope is that we can give you some of the tools and the resources you need so that you're not experiencing that as like a deal breaker, or that, that it's not really getting in your way, that it's not super severe for you. So that's one thing. And the flip side could be we might have different treatment approaches for somebody whose anxiety is secondary to their ADHD problems, right? And then we could just really focus on decreasing the impairment caused by ADHD.
Would it help you know what to treat first or how strongly?
Yes. So we often see kids who they present with ADHD and anxiety, and the parents are like, what should we do first? And it's not an easy question. So if we knew that the ADHD problems were causing the anxiety, that would be an easy answer, right? Let's treat the ADHD. If we knew that it was both, we might say, well, let's try, maybe a medication for ADHD and see if it also decreases the anxiety, but let's try to target both at the same time.
So this could become kind of a roadmap for treatment, for how to do it, what order, what's best, what to target. There's long-term implications. This is a question with two pieces, both of which, one of which sounds kind of like sci-fi to me a little bit, I have to say, which is like, if you had the ability to do some type of genetic testing, like when I was pregnant, I got a genetic testing panel, which I think most people do, to see if my daughter was going to have any potential conditions that we could deal with later, Down syndrome, whatever. Is there some universe in which something like that is done for ADHD, especially if there's a early, I know that I had it, there's a good chance she's going to have it, we test and it makes early intervention much more realistic for more kids? Like, is that something that is like a desirable thing, or does that also feel maybe like it has the implication of being like, well, we think this is going to be your life, so we're sort of getting ahead of ourselves?
I get this question a lot. I think it's going to be really individualized to the patient. If that sort of testing is available, just like in pregnancy, people should have the option to do the test and to know ahead of time what a result would mean for them, whether there is anything we can do about it, what it would mean they could expect. I think in the best case scenario, it's like you said, if a parent knew when their child was really young that they had this genetic sort of vulnerability for ADHD, we could potentially give the parent some skills that would make parenting that child easier, make the child's life easier, sort of get ahead of some of the challenges the kid could face in school and with friends, et cetera. So
you build the scaffolding earlier in life as opposed to waiting to see what happens.
Exactly.
The flip side of that, which I can imagine someone arguing, is that then you're writing a kid's story before they're even started.
Not really. I mean, so the types of interventions I'm talking about are behavioral interventions. And it's like super parenting. Like, honestly.
Super parenting. I love this idea. Tell me more.
Right. Skills that every parent could use.
Yeah.
I don't think any of it is harmful. None of it is like, oh, do this with a kid with ADHD, but not with your typically developing developing kid. I would never, all these skills are really useful. I don't think there would be any harm in trying to get ahead of it. And then acknowledging that, you have an infant right now. We're not diagnosing them with ADHD. We're saying these are some things that you could potentially
do
protect against, right? Or just try to bolster. I work with kids mostly, right? So, and kids with ADHD, I like to think of as like the most extreme version of kids, like they're the most impulsive, they're the most loud, they're the most gregarious. They're also the most loving and affectionate and like determined sometimes and really into stuff. And they're just like, they are childhood embodied and so there's so many wonderful things that can come out of that, including all the things that we talk about, creativity, thinking outside the box, just having a lot of energy and enthusiasm for life and work, etc. And so it's not that we want to decrease that. I just want to get the other part out of their way so that we can bolster those strong.
You can help clear away the executive functioning things and build everyone always talks about building skills and strategies and the scaffolding and all these things that you can do for people with ADHD.
Or even tell the teachers that this is what's going on when the child enters preschool so they don't get kicked out of preschool because they're being expected to perform like every other child in the classroom.
Yeah,
right?
Maybe it's a way to get ahead of some things.
Yeah.
As opposed to waiting for them to become a problem.
Right.
But I also hear in that you're saying, and this is something that we hear a lot for ADHD stuff, that it's a universal design piece where it's like, it's not like you're going to edit out a kid's personality by doing these things. You're not recommending putting them on stimulants when they're 2.
Right.
What you're saying is you can make life easier. And even if they don't necessarily develop ADHD, these are going to be skills that benefit them no matter what.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And it seems like almost something we should be doing regardless of whatever comes out of this type of research.
And then, the other part of this is that some of the rare variants that we study that we have associated with ADHD in families, different kinds of changes to those same genes have been associated with autism and intellectual disability and some medical side effects like seizures or changes to the brain development or maybe cardiac problems. Like there are some other features that can come along with a gene change that would be really helpful to know from a medical standpoint. I think because I'm in science, like I like to know more. And some parents also just want to know what's the reason for this, and that's enough for them. But I also really respect the parents who are like, this is my kid, regardless of what it says on that piece of paper. So it's just not an interest.
A very interesting approach. It's the kind of thing that it feels so new. It feels so modern, and it feels like you could find a lot of controversy within it, and you could also find a lot of ways that people would be really happy to receive it. Like it's an interesting new perspective, especially when you think of neurodiversity as something that's like a burgeoning identity for a lot of people.
But that's been going on with prenatal testing forever.
Something I think about a lot, and something that a lot of people with ADHD often ask each other is, if you could get rid of your ADHD, would you do it? For me, the answer changes by the hour. Was it a good week? Bad week? Am I feeling creative? Am I feeling disorganized? It really depends. And all this talk about genes made me wonder, if we can identify the genetic markers for ADHD, is there a universe sometime far in the future where we could simply choose not to have it? Or, and this felt a little bit more realistic, could a person's genetic profile one day help with early detection and through that, early interventions for ADHD? I ran all this by Anne to see how she's thinking about it.
I can't speak for people with ADHD about whether they would want to get rid of it or not. That would never be my choice. It's not my goal currently. My goal would be earlier identification to provide families with the scaffolding, like you said, to support these kids. I think the idea that the genetic data could tell us about comorbidity is also really important because some of the most impairing features of ADHD aren't the inattention and the hyperactivity, but the things that come along with it, like the anxiety, like substance abuse. That's a huge problem. Juvenile delinquency, kids ending up in juvie because they've made impulsive choices and gotten in trouble with the law. Like some of those things are pretty big, right? And it would be nice to know specifically what we need to have a heads up about and how we need to support each person individually with ADHD. I think the other thing is, as I said, a lot of these genes that we're discovering have already been associated with autism and intellectual disability. So what we're doing is broadening what we call the phenotype, the behavioral sort of manifestations of the gene, so that if there's something like severe intellectual disability or profound intellectual disability where maybe you would think about using CRISPR to change the genome, it's important to know that different changes to that same gene could result in profound intellectual disability or mild ADHD or
Yeah.
anxiety. It's important to know that there's nuances to this.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but it sounds like you're saying genes aren't, it's not like somebody wrote your future in your genes.
Right.
So many things can happen. A genetic profile isn't necessarily a personality or a person at all. It's simply things you can know and learn from, hopefully, but not every single thing that's in your genome is going to be expressed. Is that right?
Right. That's definitely true.
In your dream of dreams, I can have anything I want. The store is free. What do you hope this will achieve? Your research, the things that you guys are doing now, 10, 15 years down the line, 30 years, what do you see happening?
I do think there's a lot of value in people understanding themselves. As I said, there isn't much we can do with this information on an individual basis right now. But when we do let families know that we've found a variant, there's a sense of relief often that they just kind of understand themselves and their family or their child. And then, the other thing that comes along with that is that they're suddenly part of a new community of families who have a change to this particular gene. For example, there are these family groups for different genes. Helping people understand themselves to the degree that they find helpful is sort of the ultimate goal.
I love that. I love that as a science goal too, because it's something in the ADHD community, we talk a lot about the value of belonging, of understanding who we are via what we know about our brains, and you can celebrate it, or you can try to work with it, or you can do all sorts of things with it. But knowing who you are and that you're part of a group of other people who understand is everything.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked today a little bit about the evolution of the ADHD profile and how some of these traits were really adaptive.
Yes.
Many, many, many years ago. And now we've created this society where these traits don't always fit in well. So when you find a community and you feel like you've found a place for your traits where they are valued or respected. And I think that's so important. And everybody has that to some degree, right?
Well, you hope.
But
right?
Yeah.
I love that. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
this
sure.
was awesome.
Yeah. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Hyperfocus. If you have any questions or ideas for future topics, write me an email or send a voice memo to hyperfocus@understood.org. Hyperfocus is made by me, Ray Jacobson, and Cody Nelson. Our video producer is Calvin Knee. Our music comes from Blue Dot Sessions, and Justin D. Wright mixes the show. Samaya Adams is our supervising producer, Brianna Berry is our production director, and Neil Drumming is our editorial director. This show is brought to you by understood.org. Our executive directors are Laura Key, Scott Koshier, and Seth Melnick. Understood is a nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering people with learning and thinking differences like ADHD and dyslexia. If you want to help us continue this work, you can donate at understood.org/give.